No one warns you about this part, not the growth, what comes after it, because outgrowing your old life doesn't immediately give you a new one. It leaves you in between, where old conversations feel shallow, but new ones don't exist yet, where you don't belong where you were, but you haven't found where you fit. And in that space, you're not lost, you're evolving. But it doesn't feel like evolution, it feels like isolation, and most people mistake that feeling for a sign to go back. There is a kind of loneliness that does not come from being alone. It comes from no longer belonging to the version of life that once made sense to you. You still sit with the same people. You still move through the same environments. From the outside, nothing appears dramatically different. But internally, something has shifted. Conversations that once felt natural now feel distant. Goals that once energized you now feel strangely hollow. The rhythm of life around you continues, but you no longer move in sync with it, and the unsettling part is this: no one else seems to notice. You begin to feel invisible in a very specific way, not unseen physically, but unrecognized psychologically, as if you have changed languages internally, while everyone around you is still speaking the old one, and you start to wonder, quietly, is something wrong with me, or have I simply moved somewhere others haven't yet? Modern culture does not have a clear place for this experience. It understands loneliness as isolation, as a lack of connection, as something to be solved socially, but it rarely recognizes the loneliness that emerges from growth. Because growth in the cultural narrative is supposed to look like progress, more success, more clarity, more confidence, not disconnection, not quiet detachment, not this subtle sense of standing outside the very system you once participated in so naturally. Society rewards those who remain aligned with its structures. It validates those who continue to perform within its expectations. But when you begin to outgrow those expectations, not in rebellion, but in awareness, there is no clear script to follow, no shared language, no visible path. You are no longer fully inside the system, but you are not yet established outside of it, and so you exist in between. And this in between space, this psychological threshold, is where the loneliness begins. This experience is not new, it is deeply human, and it was something Carl Jung spoke about with a kind of quiet precision. He believed that much of life is spent building a social self, a persona that allows us to function within the collective. But there comes a point where this persona no longer reflects the deeper truth of who we are. And when that happens, the psyche begins to withdraw its energy from it, not suddenly, but gradually. You begin to feel less invested in roles that once defined you, less motivated by outcomes that once mattered, less connected to identities that once felt stable. Jung saw this not as dysfunction, but as development, a movement toward what he called individuation, the process of becoming internally whole. But individuation carries a cost, because as you separate from the collective identity, you also separate from the sense of belonging that came with it, and in that separation, loneliness emerges, not because you are alone, but because you are no longer fully identified with what surrounds you. As Jung once reflected, in essence, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But he did not say it would feel comfortable. To understand this loneliness more deeply, it helps to see it not as a single feeling, but as a progression of inner shifts, each one subtle, each one transformative. The first shift, the quiet disconnection, it begins almost imperceptibly. You still participate in your life as usual. You show up, you engage, you respond, but internally, something feels slightly out of place. You begin to notice a gap between what you are doing and how you feel about it. A meeting that once felt important now feels performative. A conversation that once felt engaging now feels repetitive. A goal that once motivated you now feels disconnected from your deeper self. This is not dramatic dissatisfaction, it is quiet disconnection. And because it is subtle, you may ignore it at first, but over time it becomes harder to overlook because the gap continues to widen. And what you begin to sense without fully articulating it is this: I am still here. but I am no longer fully in this. The second shift, the loss of shared meaning. As the disconnection deepens, something more profound occurs. You begin to lose the sense of shared meaning with the people around you, not because they are wrong, but because your internal framework has changed. What they value may no longer resonate with you. What excites them may no longer move you. What concerns them may no longer feel significant in the same way. And this creates a subtle but persistent distance. You can still interact, you can still relate on the surface, but something deeper is no longer aligned. This is where loneliness intensifies, because connection is not just about presence, it is about shared perception. And when perception shifts, connection becomes more complex. Viktor Frankl once wrote, "When a person cannot find meaning, they become sensitive to pleasure." But what happens when even pleasure begins to feel insufficient? You are left not with distraction, but with the deeper task of redefining meaning itself. And that process is often solitary. The third shift, the encounter with inner depth. If you do not resist this loneliness, if you do not rush to fill it with noise or distraction, it begins to change its quality. It becomes less about absence and more about depth. You start to turn inward, not out of withdrawal, but out of necessity, because the external world no longer provides the same sense of orientation, and in that inward movement you begin to encounter parts of yourself that were previously unnoticed. Questions emerge, not about what to do next, but about what truly matters. You begin to reflect more deeply, to observe your own patterns, to notice your own contradictions. This is where the loneliness becomes transformative, because it is no longer just separation from others. It becomes a space for meeting yourself, as Jung suggested, who looks outside, dreams, who looks inside, awakens. But awakening is not a social experience, it is an intimate one, and intimacy with yourself often requires distance from the noise of the collective. The fourth shift, the reconstruction of belonging. Eventually, something begins to reorganize, not quickly, not clearly, but steadily. You begin to form a new relationship with the world, not based on unconscious conformity, but on conscious alignment. You no longer seek belonging in the same way. You are less interested in being understood by everyone and more interested in being truthful with yourself. And paradoxically, this changes the nature of your connections. They may become fewer, but they become deeper, because they are no longer based on shared roles or expectations, but on shared awareness. This is where loneliness softens, not because you return to the system, but because you begin to build a life that reflects your inner reality. And in that reflection, a different kind of belonging emerges, one that is quieter, but more authentic. There is a scene that captures this transition with a kind of quiet honesty. A man sits in a cafe, surrounded by conversation. Laughter moves from table to table. People speak easily, effortlessly. He watches, not with envy, but with a sense of distance. He could join in, he knows how to, but something in him hesitates, because the version of himself that would have joined so easily no longer feels entirely true. So he sits there, present but separate, and in that separation he feels both the weight of loneliness and the clarity of authenticity. Another scene unfolds in a different way. A woman walks through a familiar neighborhood at dusk. The streets are the same, the houses unchanged, but her experience of them has shifted. Memories surface, versions of herself that once moved through these spaces with certainty, and now she feels like a visitor in her own past, not disconnected from it, but no longer defined by it. There is a quiet grief in that recognition, but also a subtle freedom, because she is no longer confined to who she was. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." What he pointed to was this, that transformation requires a period of internal disorder, a loosening of structure, a dissolution of certainty, and in that dissolution, loneliness is almost inevitable, because you are no longer anchored in what was familiar. but you are not yet grounded in what is emerging. You are, in a sense, between worlds, and that space, though uncomfortable, is where new identity forms. As this process deepens, it eventually leads to a more existential realization. Time continues regardless of alignment. Life moves forward whether or not you feel connected to it, and this introduces a quiet urgency, not panic, but awareness. The awareness that the life you are living is not indefinite, and that the question of belonging is not just social, it is existential. Where do I truly belong within my own life? Not in the system, not in the expectations of others, but within yourself. Because at the end of life, what remains is not how well you fit into structures, but whether you felt at home within your own existence. There is an image, simple but profound. An older man sits alone in a quiet room. The world he once moved through has faded into memory. What remains are not the roles he played, but the moments he felt most aligned with himself. And the question that lingers is not about success, but about authenticity. Was I ever truly where I was? The strange loneliness that comes with outgrowing the system is not a flaw. It is not a failure of connection. It is a sign of psychological movement, a sign that your inner world is no longer fully contained by external structures. And while it may feel like loss, loss of familiarity, loss of shared meaning, loss of easy belonging, it is also the beginning of something more honest, because what you are moving toward is not isolation, but integration, a life where your external reality reflects your internal truth, and that kind of alignment does not come from fitting in. It comes from understanding yourself deeply enough to stand slightly apart without losing your sense of self. If this feeling has been quietly present in your life, this subtle distance, this unspoken loneliness, then perhaps it is not something to escape. Perhaps it is something to understand, because within it is the beginning of a more conscious way of being. And if this reflection resonates with something you've been experiencing internally, you may want to stay connected to these conversations, not for answers, but for deeper questions. Consider subscribing or sharing this with someone who might be standing in that same quiet space between who they were and who they are becoming.